The Mongol advance into Europe in 1241-1242 was not a chaotic raid or a sudden explosion of force. It was a perfectly coordinated military operation that unfolded with machine-like precision across thousands of kilometers. When Western chroniclers described the invaders as demons on horseback, it wasn't superstition alone. It was their attempt to explain how an enemy could move so fast, strike so hard, and adapt so intelligently that entire kingdoms collapsed before they understood what they were facing. The campaign began long before the Mongols reached European soil. Their commanders had spent years gathering intelligence, mapping rivers, fortresses, and supply routes, and learning the political fractures of the region. They knew which princes were rivals, which cities lacked unity, and which armies were slow to mobilize. When they finally crossed into Eastern Europe, it felt less like an invasion and more like the execution of a plan that had been perfected far away on the steppe. Their speed was their first weapon. Mongol armies did not wait for spring roads or clear skies. They advanced during harsh winters when rivers froze solid, turning obstacles into pathways. European armies, accustomed to seasonal campaigning, were simply not ready for an enemy that could march day and night, covering distances in a week that others took a month to cross. Messages of danger traveled slower than the danger itself. By the time news of one Mongol victory reached a king, the same forces had already struck at his borders. Their coordination was the second weapon. Although the Mongol armies were divided into separate columns, these columns moved like parts of the same body. One force would bypass strongholds, another would encircle, another would cut off reinforcements, all following a strategy designed by commanders who understood both mobility and timing better than any contemporary European general. What looked like chaos from afar was actually a web tightening around their targets. Their tactics were the third weapon. European knights expected face clashes, heavy cavalry charges, and predictable battlefield formations. The Mongols offered none of that. Instead, they used feigned retreats to lure knights into traps, rained volleys of arrows from composite bows with far superior range, and struck from angles where Europeans had no defenses. When armored knights pursued fleeing Mongol units, they were led into ambushes where hidden riders or engineers waited. What felt like victory in the chase became disaster in moments. Engineering was the fourth weapon. The Mongols did not avoid fortified cities. They dismantled them. They brought Chinese and Persian engineers capable of building siege towers, catapults, and explosives on the spot. Cities that believed their walls offered safety discovered that the invaders could breach stone as easily as they destroyed armies in the open. Finally, the Mongols fought as a unified, disciplined force guided by clear leadership and unquestioned obedience. Every movement, every feint, every strike was part of a greater design. Europe did not fall because its soldiers were weak. It fell because its political and military systems were centuries behind an enemy whose warfare combined speed, intelligence gathering, mobility, and psychological dominance into one terrifying advance. The battles of Legnica and Mohi did not simply demonstrate Mongol strength. They exposed the deep, structural weaknesses within Europe's military traditions. For centuries, European warfare had revolved around the knight, armored, mounted, and trained for close combat. This system worked well against other European armies, where engagements were often predictable, seasonal, and governed by familiar tactics. But when confronted with the Mongols, these strengths became liabilities, and the old ways of fighting collapsed with alarming speed. At Legnica, the Polish and German forces assembled under Henry the Pious believed that their heavy cavalry charge, considered the most fearsome force in Europe, would break any opponent. But the Mongols had no intention of meeting them in a straightforward clash. Instead, they used smoke, mobility, and deception to fracture the coalition army before the battle even reached its peak. European forces often fought under banners and visual signals, so when Mongol archers filled the field with smoke and dust, these signals became useless. Units became isolated, commanders lost track of their soldiers, and the battlefield turned into a maze of confusion. The Mongols, accustomed to fluid, fast-paced warfare, navigated the chaos with ease, firing volleys with deadly precision while retreating in calculated stages. When the Europeans pursued what they believed was a fleeing enemy, they charged straight into encirclement. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a collapse of an entire tactical world. Meanwhile, at Mohi, the Hungarian army faced an even more sophisticated display of Mongol strategy. King Belleroman forces assembled behind the Sajo River, believing the waterway and a heavily defended bridge would give them a defensive advantage. But the Mongols approached the problem like engineers as much as warriors. While one division attacked the bridge with noise and ferocity, creating the illusion of a full frontal assault, another quietly constructed a pontoon bridge downstream. By the time the Hungarians realized the deception, Mongol cavalry had crossed the river from two directions, turning what looked like a secure position into a trap. Once again, Europe's reliance on slow, armored troops proved disastrous. Heavy knights struggled to maneuver in confined spaces and muddy terrain, while Mongol horsemen fired at full gallop, withdrew, then re-engaged with perfect timing. The Hungarians attempted a night withdrawal, but Mongol scouts, constantly tracking their movements, signaled the main force, which then boxed them in with a semicircle of cavalry and catapult fire. Panic spread, discipline broke, and the Hungarian army disintegrated. Both battles revealed that Europe lacked not only mobility, but also unity. The kingdoms of Poland and Hungary fought alone, with minimal coordination and delayed reinforcements. Their armies were feudal, built from nobles who answered summons when convenient and fought with personal retainers rather than professional, standardized units. In contrast, the Mongol military was a single coherent machine, operating under strict discipline and centralized command. Every soldier knew his role, every maneuver had a purpose, and every battle was part of a broader campaign. The defeats at Legnica and Mohi were not isolated failures. They were symptoms of Europe's unpreparedness for an enemy that fought with speed, intelligence, and adaptability. Europe had strong warriors but weak systems, brave knights but outdated tactics. Against an opponent who studied their weaknesses, manipulated their expectations, and controlled the pace of every engagement, those limitations became fatal. Mongol warfare in Europe was not simply a contest of strength. It was a demonstration of a military philosophy that combined precision, discipline, and psychological manipulation in ways European commanders had never encountered. The Mongols did not enter battles. They *designed them. Every movement, every retreat, every arrow shot was part of a sequence intended to break not only the enemy's ranks, but their confidence and sense of control. Their warfare operated on multiple levels at once: tactical, strategic, psychological, and logistical. This made their campaigns feel less like traditional invasions and more like the slow closing of a trap that had been set long before the enemy realized the danger. Their archery alone transformed the battlefield. Mongol riders could hit targets at full gallop, twisting their bodies in mid-motion while releasing arrows with accuracy that stunned European observers. Their composite bows, made from wood, horn, and sinew, out-ranged European longbows and crossbows, firing faster and farther. This meant the Mongols could kill from distances where European soldiers couldn't respond. Heavy knights, designed for close combat, were forced to chase an enemy they could not catch. Foot soldiers, weighed down by armor, became targets in a deadly shooting gallery. Each volley of arrows was not only meant to injure, it was meant to disrupt formations, sow fear, and force commanders into reactive decisions. But archery was only one part of a larger system. The Mongols perfected the art of the feigned retreat, a tactic almost unheard of in Europe. A Mongol unit would appear to break and flee, drawing knights into a chase that played directly into their hands. European knights, driven by a culture that prized personal courage and decisive charges, almost always took the bait. Once separated from infantry support, they were surrounded by fresh Mongol units waiting in ambush. What seemed like the enemy's collapse was actually the opening move of encirclement. Engineering formed another critical dimension of their warfare. The Mongols traveled with teams of Chinese and Persian engineers who could assemble siege machines on demand. Catapults, trebuchets, battering rams, and even early gunpowder-based weapons. European cities, confident in the strength of their stone walls, found themselves overwhelmed by a mobile siege force that required no supply trains or pre-built equipment. The Mongols built their machines from local materials, using speed and improvisation to keep pressure on defenders who expected a long siege. Instead of being starved out slowly, cities were crushed quickly, their defenses neutralized with shocking efficiency. Their intelligence network also played a decisive role. Mongol scouts and spies gathered detailed information about European terrain, alliances, and troop movements long before the campaign began. They mapped rivers, studied local politics, and identified weak points in defenses. This intelligence allowed their commanders to anticipate European strategies and counter them before they even formed. When a Mongol army appeared at a city's gates, it was not by coincidence. It was because the commanders knew exactly when the defenders would be unprepared. Psychological warfare tied everything together. Massacres of resisting cities, strategic sparing of those that surrendered, and the rapid, unpredictable movements of their armies created a sense of inevitability around their advance. Rumors of their invincibility spread faster than the armies themselves, demoralizing opponents before the battle started. For many European forces, defeat began not on the battlefield, but in the mind. All these elements, archery, mobility, deception, engineering, intelligence, and fear, merged into a single, cohesive system. It wasn't the strength of Mongol warriors alone that shook Europe. It was the overwhelming sophistication of their approach, a form of warfare generations ahead of what European armies were prepared to face. Europe in 1242 did not survive because its armies suddenly grew stronger or because its kings discovered a way to halt the Mongol advance. Europe survived because events thousands of kilometers away reshaped the destiny of every rider on the Western Front. To understand why the invasion ended, one must understand the way power functioned within the Mongol Empire. No matter how vast their conquests, no matter how successful their generals, all authority flowed from a single figure, the Great Khan. When Ojdai Khan died in December 1241, the foundations of Mongol governance trembled. His death was not just a personal loss. It triggered a massive political shift that demanded the return of every prince of Genghis Khan's lineage. And the commanders leading the invasion of Europe were not ordinary generals. They were royal princes and direct descendants of Genghis. Their presence was required for the Kurultai, the grand assembly that would choose the next ruler of the empire. This meant that the Mongol armies in Europe were suddenly caught between two obligations, the duty of conquest and the duty of empire. No prince could ignore the call to return to Mongolia without jeopardizing his status, his influence, and even his life. The succession of a new great Khan was the most important event in the Mongol political world. and failing to participate in it was tantamount to rebellion. Thus, even though the Mongols stood at the threshold of Central and Western Europe, with Hungary shattered, Poland defeated, and the Holy Roman Empire exposed, they began withdrawing, not because Europe had broken them, but because the empire needed them elsewhere. Yet Europe misunderstood this retreat for centuries. Chroniclers across the continent wrote of miracles, divine intervention, or the supernatural protection of Christian nations. Others imagined internal Mongol collapse, supply shortages, or epidemics. These explanations made sense to Europeans who could not imagine an army abandoning a nearly complete invasion. But none of these theories matched the Mongols' organization or the broader geopolitical reality. Their retreat was not chaotic. It was orderly, strategic, and synchronized across multiple fronts. They burned remaining supplies, gathered captives, and withdrew in tight formations, leaving a wake of destruction, but no signs of internal crisis. Europe also misjudged the Mongols' long-term intentions. Many believed the withdrawal meant the threat had passed permanently, but in truth, the Mongols considered their campaign unfinished. They left garrisons, continued gathering intelligence, and monitored the politics of Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire. Had the succession in Mongolia been resolved quickly, nothing prevented them from returning. The only reason they never rode west again was because internal politics within the empire consumed the years that followed. Power struggles, new campaigns in China and the Middle East, and shifts in leadership redirected Mongol attention elsewhere. Thus, Europe's survival was a historical accident, an outcome not shaped by battlefield triumph, but by timing. Every kingdom, fortress, and army from Vienna to Venice was spared by a single piece of news carried across the steppe. The death of a distant emperor mattered more than the resistance of an entire continent. For generations afterward, European rulers wondered what might have happened if that message had arrived just a month later, or if the princes had chosen conquest over politics. The continent avoided devastation not by strength, but by the fragile thread of circumstance that pulled the Mongols away at the very moment. Their victory seemed inevitable. The Mongol invasion left Europe with a question that echoed through generations. What would have happened if the horsemen had not turned back in 1242? This uncertainty came not only from the scale of destruction they had already inflicted, but from how close they were to striking the political and cultural heart of the continent. In a matter of months, they had annihilated the armies of Poland and Hungary, shattered regional powers, and left vast territories defenseless. Their withdrawal created a vacuum, an unfinished story, forcing scholars, kings, and historians to imagine the fate of Europe had that story reached its final chapter. The fear of what might have come next was based on cold, observable facts. Hungary, one of the strongest kingdoms of the region, was effectively broken as a state. Its cities burned, its countryside emptied, and its defenses ruined. Poland was similarly devastated, its nobility scattered, and military leadership dead. These were not marginal regions, they were Europe's first line of defense. With them gone, the Mongols had opened paths leading directly into the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, Bohemia, and Italy, lands that held immense political, religious, and economic importance. And unlike Eastern Europe, these regions were not preparing for a Mongol storm. They were divided by internal conflicts, slow decision-making, and the deep rivalries of medieval politics. If the Mongols had continued their advance, they would likely have struck Vienna next. The city was strategically placed on the Danube, acting as a gateway to Central Europe. Contemporary records show that the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Roman II was embroiled in conflict with the papacy, which meant that coordinated, continent-wide resistance was nearly impossible. European leaders rarely united even for threats they understood. Against a vast, unfamiliar enemy, unity would have been even more difficult to achieve. The Mongols, accustomed to exploiting disunity, could have advanced further with the same deadly momentum they carried through Hungary and Poland. Beyond Vienna lay the Italian state, rich, fragmented, and heavily urbanized. Cities like Venice, Milan, and Florence were powerful but divided. Their rivalries meant that cooperation against an external invader was unlikely. Mongol engineering and siege capabilities had already proven effective against fortified cities in China, Persia, and Eastern Europe. Italian city-states, despite their wealth and walls, would have struggled against coordinated siege machines, fire weapons, and relentless cavalry harassment. France, too, was not in a position to respond quickly. The kingdom was strong in culture and resources, but slow in mobilization, with regional lords controlling much of its military power. England, separated by the Channel, was safe for the moment, but unable to influence events on the continent. Had France fallen or been weakened, the political landscape of Western Europe would have been altered beyond recognition. The Church, one of the most influential powers in medieval Europe, also feared the implications of a Mongol advance. If the Mongols had pressed into Italy, Rome itself could have been threatened. The idea of an unstoppable pagan empire reaching the heart of Christendom created both panic and fascination throughout Europe. All these possibilities shaped the lingering question, not whether the Mongols could conquer Europe, but what Europe would have become under their rule. Would the continent's political structure have collapsed? Would its culture have blended with the vast Eurasian world the Mongols connected? Would the Renaissance have been delayed, transformed, or prevented entirely? These unanswered questions became part of Europe's historical consciousness. The Mongols had already transformed every region they conquered. The fact that Europe escaped their full impact not by strength, but by timing made the what-if even more haunting. The continent lived with the knowledge that its survival was accidental, and that its fate had hung on a single moment in a distant empire. The Mongol invasion of 1241-1242 was more than a campaign. It was a reminder of how fragile the balance of power can be. In barely a year, an army born on the distant steppes reshaped the map of Europe, shattered kingdoms, and forced an entire continent to confront its own weaknesses. What Europe had believed to be unbreakable proved vulnerable. What it thought permanent proved temporary, and what it assumed safe stood on the edge of collapse. Yet in the end, it was not steel or strategy that saved Europe, but circumstance, a single moment in a faraway empire that pulled back the very force poised to rewrite the history of the West. The Mongols left behind ruins, fear, and unanswered questions, but they also left behind a lesson that no civilization, no matter how confident, is beyond the reach of greater tides of history. The invasion did not end with a decisive victory or a heroic stand. It ended with silence, the silence of hooves turning east, the silence of kings realizing how close they came to losing everything, and the silence of a question that still echoes through time. What if they had not turned back? That question remains one of the most haunting what-ifs in Europe's past, a reminder that history is shaped not only by battles won, but by battles never fought. Thank you for listening. Your attention, your curiosity, and your willingness to explore the deeper layers of history make journeys like this meaningful. May we continue to learn from the past, not only to honor those who lived it, but to understand the world we walk through today.